The heat was a physical weight on Havenwood Street, pressing down on the manicured lawns and shimmering off the asphalt in lazy, distorted waves. For 10-year-old Leo, it was more than just weather. It was a form of judgment. The sun seemed to find the metal of his leg brace and bake it, a constant, dull ache that radiated from his calf to his hip. He sat behind a rickety card table, a monument to childhood ambition that listed precariously to one side. A hand-painted sign, its letters wobbling with earnest effort, read, "Lemonade 50 cents" in front of him. A large glass pitcher sweated onto the worn wood, the ice within already surrendering to the oppressive afternoon. He was a small, still point in a world that moved too fast, a world that seemed designed to make him feel perpetually out of step. The other kids were at the community pool, their joyful shrieks echoing from blocks away. Leo couldn't run and jump and splash with them. His leg, a souvenir from a birth defect doctors had called a misprint in the code, tethered him to a slower, more observant existence. From his perch at the end of his driveway, he saw the neighborhood's subtle cruelties. He saw Mrs. Gable peer through her blinds, her face a mask of pinched pity that felt worse than outright scorn. He saw cars slow down, the driver's eyes flicking from his brace to his hopeful sign, and then speed up, as if his quiet presence was an inconvenience. Humiliation wasn't a grand event. It was 1,000 tiny paper cuts throughout the day. It was the way kids his age would cycle past in a pack, laughing, their legs pumping effortlessly, and pointedly ignore his small wave. It was the silence that fell when he approached a group, the sudden, intense interest they all developed in their shoes. Today, the cut was deeper. A single car had stopped, a minivan driven by a mother with 2 kids in the back. Hope, bright and fragile, had fluttered in Leo's chest. The woman had smiled a tired, sympathetic smile. "Just one, please," she'd said, fumbling in her purse. As Leo carefully poured the lemonade, his hand trembling slightly from the effort of holding the heavy pitcher steady, he heard one of the children in the back whisper loudly, "Mommy, why does that boy walk funny?" "His leg is all robot," the mother's face flushed. She snatched the cup, thrust a dollar bill into his hand without meeting his eyes, and muttered, "Keep the change," before screeching away from the curb. The pity burned hotter than the sun. Leo stared at the crumpled dollar, the 50 cents of profit feeling like a payment for a spectacle. He carefully tucked the bill into the small metal box he used for cash and readjusted his brace, the familiar squeak of leather and metal a lonely sound in the suffocating quiet. He was just a boy trying to sell lemonade, trying to earn a few dollars to help his mom, who worked 2 jobs and still looked at the bills on the kitchen table with a silent, weary dread. But here, on this street, he wasn't a boy. He was a curiosity, problem, a robot leg. The pitcher was still mostly full. The ice was almost gone. The day stretched before him, a long, empty road of shimmering heat and quiet dismissal. The afternoon wore on, each passing minute a small defeat. The sun began its slow descent, but the heat clung to the pavement with stubborn ferocity. Leo's brief flicker of hope had long since been extinguished, replaced by a familiar, hollow ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his leg. That's when he saw them. Chad Henderson and his 2 friends, Kevin and Mark, appeared at the end of the block, their bicycles weaving lazily across the street. Chad was a year older, bigger, with a mean-spirited confidence that came from a life of casual privilege. His father, Mr. Henderson, owned the largest house on the street, a 2-story colonial with a perfectly green lawn that seemed to sneer at the more modest homes around it. Chad rode as if he owned the asphalt beneath his tires, and in a way he did. He was the king of this small suburban kingdom, and Leo was his favorite jester. They coasted to a stop in front of his stand, forming a semicircle that felt less like a gathering and more like a blockade. Chad propped his bike on its kickstand and sauntered over, a smirk playing on his lips. "Well, well, look what we have here," he said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "It's Pegleg Leo." The businessman Kevin and Mark snickered on cue. Leo stayed silent, his hands gripping the edge of the wobbly table. He knew the script. He knew his lines were silence and endurance. "How's business, Leo?" Chad continued, leaning in close, his shadow falling over the pitcher. Selling lots of your special recipe? Leo just stared at the pitcher, watching a bead of condensation trail down the glass like a tear. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or did your robot leg run out of batteries? Chad poked the pitcher with his finger, making it wobble. I'm thirsty. How about a free sample for your best customer? Before Leo could react, Chad grabbed the pitcher. He didn't pour a glass. He lifted it to his lips and took a long, noisy gulp, lemonade dribbling down his chin. He then spat a mouthful onto the dusty ground near Leo's feet. Ugh, too sweet, he declared, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. You're no good at this, Leo. You're no good at anything. With a final, contemptuous shove, Chad pushed the pitcher. It tipped, slid across the table, and crashed onto the driveway, shattering into a dozen large pieces. The pale yellow liquid pooled on the hot asphalt, a sticky, tragic puddle that was already attracting ants. The sound of breaking glass was sharp and final. It echoed in the silence that followed. Kevin and Mark looked momentarily uncomfortable, their sycophantic laughter dying in their throats. From across the street, Mr. Henderson emerged from his garage, holding a leaf blower. He saw the scene. His son standing over a shattered pitcher, a smaller, disabled boy sitting frozen in his chair. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Leo saw no disapproval, no flicker of parental shame. He saw only a cold, dismissive indifference, the same look he gave the dandelions that dared to sprout in his perfect lawn. Mr. Henderson turned his back, yanked the cord on the leaf blower, and the world was filled with its obnoxious roar, a sound that drowned out everything. The quiet sobs catching in Leo's throat, the frantic beating of his heart, the finality of his defeat. Chad, emboldened by his father's silent approval, just laughed. Clean up your mess, pegleg, he sneered, before getting back on his bike. The three of them rode off, their laughter trailing behind them, as cruel and sharp as the shards of glass glinting in the sun. Leo was left alone with the wreckage, the sweet smell of wasted effort rising from the ground. Leo didn't cry. Tears were a luxury, a release he couldn't afford in public. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, his movements slow and deliberate. He carefully picked up the larger pieces of glass, his fingers avoiding the sharp edges, and placed them in the now empty cardboard box that had held his cups. The world had shrunk to this small patch of driveway, to the sticky puddle and the glittering fragments of his afternoon. As he worked, his mind drifted back, seeking an anchor in the storm of his emotions. He thought of his father. Staff Sergeant Samuel Vance hadn't been a big man, but he'd carried himself with a quiet gravity that made people listen. He had been Leo's hero, not just for the uniform he wore, but for the way he'd treated him. His father had never seen the brace as a weakness. He'd called it Leo's armor, quiet strength Leo. He used to say, his voice a low, comforting rumble. They would sit on the porch steps in the evenings, Samuel patiently helping Leo with the complicated buckles and straps of the brace. It's not about being the loudest in the room. It's not about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about holding your ground when it's easier to run. It's about being kind when the world gives you every reason not to be. That's real strength. The kind that matters. His father had been deployed when Leo was 7 and had come home 9 months later under a folded flag. The quiet strength he'd spoken of was all Leo had left of him, a legacy he tried to honor every single day. His mother, Sarah, tried her best. She was a whirlwind of perpetual motion, working a day shift as a receptionist and an evening shift waiting tables at a diner. Her love for Leo was fierce and absolute, but her energy was finite. He saw the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders when she came home late at night, the worry etched in the lines around her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. He heard her on the phone with the insurance company, her voice tight with frustration as she argued about coverage for a new, better-fitting brace for him. Growth spurts, she'd say to him with a forced, bright smile. You're getting too big for your armor. The lemonade stand had been his idea. He had found the wobbly card table in the garage, a relic from his parents' first apartment. He'd spent a whole Saturday painting the sign, carefully outlining the letters in pencil before filling them in with blue paint. It was his attempt to contribute, to ease the burden that he sometimes felt he was. He'd imagined surprising his mom with a small jar of crumpled bills and coins, a tangible piece of help. He wanted to see her smile, a real smile, not the tired one she wore like a uniform. Now that dream lay shattered on the ground with the picture. He swept the smaller shards of glass into a dustpan, his movements methodical. He used a rag and the bottle of water he'd kept for himself to wipe away the sticky residue. His own thirst a distant, unimportant fact. Each shard of glass he collected felt like a piece of Chad's scorn. Each sticky drop of lemonade a reminder of Mr. Henderson's cold indifference. This was his ground, this broken, sticky patch of driveway. His father's words echoed in his mind, not as a grand command, but as a quiet, steadying hum. Be kind when the world gives you every reason not to be. He finished cleaning, leaving the pavement spotless, as if nothing had ever happened. He folded the card table, tucked the sign under his arm, and carried the box of broken glass to the recycling bin. He did it all with a slow, deliberate dignity, his back straight, his head held high. No one was watching now. Mr. Henderson's leaf blower had long since gone silent. The street was empty, but Leo wasn't doing it for them. He was doing it for himself. He was holding his ground. The weight of the afternoon settled heavily in the quiet house. Leo put away the sign and the folded table, the symbols of his failed enterprise. He felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that went far beyond the heat or his physical exertion. It was the exhaustion of spirit that comes from absorbing cruelty without reacting, of turning the other cheek until it stings. He sat at the kitchen table, tracing the patterns in the worn linoleum with his finger. Outside, the world continued, oblivious. Car drove by. A dog barked. But inside Leo's small world, the pressure was building to an unbearable level. He knew Chad wouldn't let it go. Humiliating him once was never enough. The victory had to be reinforced, the dominance asserted again and again. An hour later, his fears were realized. He heard the familiar, taunting voices outside. Peeking through the living room curtains, he saw Chad and his friends had returned. This time, they weren't just passing by. They were on his lawn. Chad was holding a half-empty bag of potting soil he must have taken from his family's garage. With a theatrical flourish, he ripped it open and began to scatter the dark, rich soil over the front steps and the small patch of marigolds his mother had so carefully planted last month. "Hey, Pegleg!" Chad yelled, his voice carrying clearly through the closed window. "Your yard looks a little bare. Thought I'd help you plant something." Kevin and Mark howled with laughter, kicking at the flower beds and stomping on the delicate orange blossoms until they were just sad, broken stems pressed into the dirt. They were destroying something his mother had made, something beautiful she had created in her few precious moments of free time. This was a different kind of cruelty. It wasn't just directed at him anymore. It was an attack on his home, on his mother. Leo's hands clenched into fists. A hot, unfamiliar rage surged through him, a desire to run out there, to scream, to fight, to make them stop. But what could he do? He was one boy and they were three. His leg would betray him after a few steps. He would just end up on the ground, giving them another victory. He felt trapped, a prisoner in his own house. He scanned the street, a desperate, silent plea for help. He saw the curtains twitch in Mrs. Gable's window across the street. He saw Mr. Davies, 2 houses down, pause his lawn mowing and watch for a moment before turning away and resuming his work, his back to the scene. They all saw, they all knew, and they all did nothing. Their silence was a form of permission. It told Chad that his behavior was acceptable, that his cruelty had no consequences. It told Leo that he was alone, that his small world of quiet dignity and his mother's struggling efforts didn't matter enough for anyone to intervene. The boys, growing bolder in the vacuum of accountability, moved on to the mailbox, drawing crude pictures on it with a piece of chalk they'd produced. Leo felt something inside him break. It wasn't the defiant spirit his father had taught him, but the fragile hope that things could be different. that people could be good. He backed away from the window, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He couldn't watch anymore. He retreated to the quiet of his room, the sound of their derisive laughter a muffled torment through the walls. He sat on his bed, the metal of his brace cool against his skin, and endured. He focused on the poster of the solar system on his wall, on the silent, orderly dance of the planets. He imagined floating in that vast, cold emptiness, far away from Havenwood Street, far away from the laughter and the silence and the crushing, suffocating weight of it all. He held his ground, not with fists or with words, but with the sheer force of his will to not shatter completely. Just as the boys' jeers began to fade as they moved down the street, a new sound began to build. It started as a low, guttural vibration, a feeling more than a noise, resonating deep in Leo's chest. It grew steadily, a rhythmic, syncopated thunder that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the glass in his window frames. It was the sound of a dozen, then 24 heavy-engine motorcycles. Leo cautiously returned to the living room window. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. A procession of bikes was turning onto Havenwood Street. They weren't sleek sport bikes. They were hulking, chrome-laden beasts, ridden by men who seemed carved from granite and leather. They wore vests adorned with complex patches, their faces weathered and set in expressions that ranged from grim to utterly unreadable. At the head of the pack was a motorcycle that was more like a land yacht, and on it, a man with a long, graying beard and sunglasses that hid his eyes. As they rumbled closer, Leo recognized him. It was the man from yesterday, the one he had given the water to. The bikers didn't just pass through. They pulled over one by one, lining the curb directly in front of Leo's house and across the street. Engines were cut, and the sudden, profound silence that followed was more intimidating than the noise had been. The street, which had been a stage for petty cruelty just moments before, was now a silent, occupied territory. Doors closed quietly up and down the block. Mr. Davies' lawnmower was abruptly silent. The curtain at Mrs. Gable's window dropped as if it had been shot. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Chad and his friends, who had been making their way back up the street, froze mid-stride, their bravado evaporating like mist. They stood rooted to the sidewalk, their faces pale. The lead biker swung a heavy leg over his machine and stood, stretching his arms. He methodically removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. He scanned the scene. The dirt on the porch, the trampled marigolds, the chalk graffiti on the mailbox. His gaze then swept over the pale faces of Chad and his friends before finally settling on Leo's house. He didn't shout or make a threat. He just looked. But in that look was a deep and ancient understanding of bullies and their victims. Then, something shifted. An engine sputtered to life down the line. A biker dismounted and walked over to his saddlebag, pulling out a tool roll. Another followed, then another. They weren't preparing for a fight. They were preparing to work. One biker, a man with arms as thick as tree limbs, knelt by the trampled marigolds, his calloused fingers gently examining the broken stems with surprising tenderness. Another walked over to the mailbox, pulled a rag from his back pocket, and began wiping away the chalk. The lead biker, whom the others called Stitch, walked slowly, deliberately, up the driveway. He stopped at the exact spot where the pitcher had shattered the day before. He looked down at the clean pavement, then up at the front door, his expression unreadable. He wasn't there to exact revenge. He was there to answer a call Leo didn't even know he had made. The entire neighborhood held its breath, waiting to see what this army of leather-clad giants would do next. The pressure that had been building on Leo had now shifted, expanding to encompass the entire street. A silent, heavy judgment settling over every house that had a window, and a witness who had chosen to look away. Stitch didn't knock. He stood on the porch for a long moment, his presence alone a kind of announcement. Finally, Sarah, Leo's mother, opened the door a crack, her face a mixture of fear and confusion. She'd been in the back of the house, trying to rest between her shifts, and had been drawn out by the sudden, unnerving silence. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Stitch removed a dusty leather glove, his movements unhurried. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was surprisingly gentle. "My name is Stitch. My brothers and I were passing through yesterday. Your boy." He helped us out. Sarah's eyes darted past him to the sea of motorcycles and imposing men that filled the street. Fear was still her primary emotion. These were the kind of men people warned their children about. "My boy?" she repeated, confused. "Yes, ma'am. It was a hot day. We were in a bad way. He brought us water. Didn't ask for a thing. Just saw someone in need and did the right thing." Stitch's gaze drifted to the dirt scattered on the porch steps. "Looks like you've got some trouble around here." Sarah's protective instincts flared, momentarily overriding her fear. "We're fine. We don't want any trouble. We're not here to cause it," Stitch said, his eyes meeting hers directly. "We're here because of what your son did. In our world, ma'am, honor isn't a word you just throw around. It's a debt. Kindness is a debt. Your son showed us both. And we always pay our debts." Just then, Chad Henderson, having regained a sliver of his usual arrogance now that his father had emerged onto their front porch, couldn't resist a final jab. "What's the matter, Leo?" he yelled across the lawn, his voice cracking slightly. "Did you call your freak show friends to help you?" The words hung in the air, a final, foolish act of defiance. Every biker on the street turned their head in unison, a slow, coordinated movement that was utterly menacing. Mr. Henderson, who had been watching from his porch with a look of disdain, now looked distinctly nervous. He put a hand on his son's shoulder, but it was too late. The truth of the neighborhood's daily drama was now laid bare for the new arrivals to see. Stitch didn't look at Chad. He kept his eyes on Sarah, but his next words were for the benefit of the entire, silent audience of Havenwood Street. "Some people," he said, his voice low but carrying with perfect clarity, "think strength is about shouting the loudest or pushing the weakest. They think it's about having the greenest lawn or the biggest house." His gaze flickered for a single, powerful second toward the Hendersons' property. "We've been all over this country, seen a lot of people. Strength, real strength, is a 10-year-old boy with a leg brace, who, after getting his day ruined, still has it in him to give his last bottle of water to a stranger. That's the kind of strength that earns respect." He then looked over at Leo, who was now standing in the doorway behind his mother. "Your boy is a prince, ma'am. He's got more character in his little finger than most people have in their whole bodies. We're just here to clean up the neighborhood a little, pay back some kindness." The reveal was complete. It wasn't a dramatic confession or a shouted accusation. It was a simple, powerful statement of fact from an undeniable authority. The quiet dignity Leo had fought so hard to maintain was no longer quiet. It was now amplified by 92 chrome engines and the unwavering loyalty of a brotherhood that had recognized one of their own. The bikers' version of cleaning up was a masterclass in psychological warfare, executed without a single overt threat. They didn't march across the street to confront the Hendersons. They simply existed, their presence a constant, silent reprimand. A few of the larger members sat on the curb directly opposite the Hendersons' driveway, cleaning their sunglasses or leisurely polishing a piece of chrome, their gaze occasionally drifting toward the house. Mr. Henderson, who prided himself on his weekend yard work, made a brief, blustering attempt to start his edger, but the tool sputtered and died under the weight of a dozen silent stares. Defeated, he and a now terrified Chad retreated inside, the front door closing with a quiet click. For the rest of the day, their curtains remained drawn. With the antagonists neutralized, the bikers turned their full attention to the Vance residence. It was an astonishingly efficient and organized operation. The man who had inspected the marigolds, a biker named Tiny who was anything but, disappeared for 20 minutes and returned with 3 flats of new, vibrant orange flowers. He and 2 others meticulously cleared the ruined beds, tilled the soil, and planted the new marigolds with the care of seasoned gardeners. 2 other bikers, who apparently ran a construction business in their other lives, descended on the sagging front porch. They produced tape measures, saws, and drills from their saddlebags. With practiced ease, they tore out the rotting wood, measured new supports, and within a few hours, had constructed a new set of steps and reinforced the railing, stronger and safer than it had ever been. Another group, led by a wiry biker with grease permanently etched into his knuckles, popped the hood of Sarah's 10-year-old sedan. They diagnosed the engine's persistent rattle, changed the oil, topped off the fluids, and even replaced a worn tire with a new one they had somehow procured. They worked with a quiet, focused camaraderie, their movements economical and precise. Throughout it all, Leo watched, his initial fear replaced by a profound sense of awe. These men, who looked so fearsome, were gentle and kind. They spoke to him with respect, asking his opinion on the placement of a flower pot or letting him hold a wrench. They never mentioned his brace, never treated him as if he were fragile. They treated him like the man of the house. As the afternoon sun began to dip, Stitch called Leo over to the driveway where he and another biker were working on something. They had taken his wobbly card table and were transforming it. They had sanded it down, reinforced its legs until it was rock solid, and given it a coat of deep blue paint. The other biker, an artist with a delicate touch, was hand-painting a new sign in bold, professional lettering, Leo's Place, the best lemonade in town at the bottom. In smaller letters, he added a flourish. Quality guaranteed. The recognition was overwhelming. They hadn't just fixed what was broken. They had improved it, honored it, and given his small dream a foundation of solid oak and unwavering support. As the work wound down, the neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and shame. Mrs. Gable appeared on her porch, holding a plate of freshly baked cookies. Mr. Davies crossed the street with a pitcher of iced tea. One by one, they came, offering food, drinks, and hesitant words of apology to Sarah. They were acknowledging their failure, their silence, in the face of the biker's loud, decisive action. Finally, Stitch approached Leo. He held a small, neatly folded denim vest, child-sized. In his other hand was a small, circular patch. It was beautifully embroidered, depicting a single, clear drop of water nestled inside a silver motorcycle gear. Every club has a patch. It's how we know who we are, who we stand with, Stitch said, his voice low and serious. We call ourselves the Road Saints, not because we're saints, Lord knows, but because we try to honor the code of the road. You look out for others. You pay your debts. You respect strength of character. He handed the patch to Leo. This is your cut. Prospects patch. It means you're under our protection. It means you're one of us. Leo looked at the patch. His vision blurring with tears he refused to let fall. It was more than a gift. It was an identity, a shield, promise. He was no longer just the boy with the robot leg. He was Leo of the Road Saints. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The work was done. The Vance house stood straighter, brighter, a small island of renewal on a street still reeling from the day's events. The new porch steps were solid underfoot. The marigolds stood like tiny, cheerful soldiers guarding the walkway. Sarah's car idled smoothly in the driveway, its engine humming a quiet, reliable tune for the first time in years. And in the center of the lawn, gleaming under the twilight, sat the new lemonade stand, a testament to craftsmanship and solidarity. Leo stood on the porch, wearing the small denim vest over his t-shirt. His fingers kept tracing the intricate stitching of the patch over his heart. The water drop in the gear felt heavy, important, felt like armor, just like his father used to say. Sarah stood beside him, her arm around his shoulders. Her face, so often a mask of worry, was relaxed, etched with a gratitude so profound it left her speechless. She had tried to pay the bikers, had offered them the little cash she had, but Stitch had simply shaken his head. The boy already paid us, he'd said. Paid in full. The bikers began to mount their machines, the quiet camaraderie of their workday shifting into the disciplined preparation for departure. Leather creaked, chrome gleamed in the dying light. There was no fanfare, no grand speeches, just a series of quiet, respectful nods directed at Leo and his mother. Stitch was the last to mount his bike. He swung his leg over, the engine catching with a deep, throaty roar that settled into a powerful idle. He put on his sunglasses, the setting sun glinting off the lenses. He looked at Leo, and for a moment the boy saw past the tough exterior, past the beard and the leather to the core of the man. He saw a flicker of the same quiet strength his father had talked about. Stitch raised a single gloved hand, not in a wave, but in a slow, solemn salute. Leo, standing as tall as his brace would allow, nodded back, a silent acknowledgement passing between the 10-year-old boy and the leader of the pack. Then, with a signal Leo couldn't see, a sound unlike any Havenwood Street had ever heard erupted. 92 engines roared to life in perfect, thundering unison. It wasn't a chaotic noise. It was a symphony of controlled power, a single unified voice that shook the very foundations of the quiet suburban homes. It was a declaration. It was a warning. It was a promise. The sound was a shield, wrapping around Leo's house, a proclamation to all who could hear that this place, this boy, was protected. The procession pulled out one by one, falling into a tight, disciplined formation. Their headlights cut through the gathering dusk, a river of light flowing away from the small house they had healed. The entire neighborhood was out on their lawns now, silent, watching the spectacle. The Hendersons' curtains were pulled back just enough to reveal two pairs of eyes peering out, their expressions a mixture of fear and newfound, grudging respect. The taillights dwindled in the distance, a string of red jewels against the dark asphalt. The thunder of their engines faded, slowly replaced by the familiar chirp of crickets. But the silence they left behind was different from the silence before. It was not empty. It was filled with the lingering echo of their presence, with the weight of their actions. Leo remained on the porch long after they were gone, his hand still resting on his patch. The air was cooler now. The street was quiet. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would never be alone again. He had a brotherhood. He had 92 guardian angels who rode on wings of chrome and steel. The next morning, he would set up his new stand, fill a new pitcher, and face the world, not as the boy who walked funny, but as Leo, a prospect of the road saints, a purveyor of quality-guaranteed lemonade. A quiet kid who had learned that the truest strength was measured not in the power of one's legs, but in the kindness of one's heart.